Born in Miami, Florida. Grew up not in an aviation family. My old man was a naval officer during World War II. However, he was what you call an 50s vintage jet setter. He was traveling a lot in his business, and he flew on the airlines. And my mom would take us to the airport, and we'd hang out at the airport for an hour waiting for him to come, and we'd just stand there in awe and watch the airplanes take off and land and come in and out. And I actually got a ride on an airplane with my dad back, I think I was 6 years old. It was an Eastern Airlines Martin 404. They served a meal between Miami and Tampa. But everything about that flight just burnt into my psyche. It really did. I don't know what it did. At an early age, I knew that I wanted to fly for a living. I wanted to be an airline pilot, particularly. So what I did what all kids do. I built everything from balsa gliders to model airplanes. I found the Civil Air Patrol when I was in my teens and went and became a cadet, worked my way up to cadet lieutenant colonel. They had this thing called special activities. You're probably aware, I don't know, but in the summer of my 11th grade year, instead of doing what my older brother had done and gone on an international air cadet exchange, I saw as a way to get my parents to sign off on me learning to fly. I applied for a thing called flying encampment, and they basically sent you off to a flight school, stayed in a motel on an airport, and you learned to fly. You got a private license, and it was really kind of a good deal. I was 17 years old. That was 50 years ago this summer. It just happened to be at Cape Kennedy. They called it Cape Kennedy Regional, which is Melbourne Regional, right down the road. And it was during the Apollo launch when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Let's see. I went off to college, and Vietnam was raging. So if you didn't maintain 15 credit hours every quarter, you run the risk of losing your student deferment, and you go to Vietnam. It was just the way it was. I found a ROTC unit right over here at University of Central Florida. It wasn't called that at the time. And I got commissioned in the Air Force ROTC program when I graduated in '74. I was 1P qualified, which meant I was projected to go to pilot training. As you know, the Vietnam War wound down, and pilot training applications and slots went away. So my professor of aerospace study pulled me aside and said, you know, we can make you a navigator tomorrow if you want to go on active duty. And luckily I had a brother in the Air Force about 5 years in front of me, and he said, no, hold out for the pilot slot, which is a smart thing. I had 3 sets of orders canceled and finally got to pilot training in June of '75, a year after I graduated from college. went to pilot training, spent beautiful year at Columbus Air Force Base, which my daughter got to go to the same base, same buildings, same classrooms 37 years later. I asked for a 737, or actually I was airline oriented, so I asked for a C9, a T-43, and a 141 on my dream sheet. My T-38 flight commander said, what is a T-43? And I told him it was a 737-200 advanced. The Air Force was taking delivery of 19 of them, and are using them to replace the T-29 as navigation trainers, which is a Convair, out at Mather Air Force Base in California. Well, guess what? He got me that assignment. And I drove out to Sacramento with my wife, and we flew 5 years in the Air Force flying 737s. In that 5 years, I logged almost 3,000 hours of 737 time. Actually, I logged more than 3,000 hours of 737 time, which was unheard of in the Air Force at the time. But we flew UNT, undergraduate navigator training, and that was basically a 5.5 every day, whether you needed it or not, either morning or evening flights. We had 2 rounds of them go out every day. And then we also had a MAC mission or a AMC mission. We had 3 airplanes that were 55-seat configuration for carrying IG teams and ROTC, CAP cadets, Air Force band. We did a lot of work for Air University down in Montgomery. We brought speakers in and out and stuff like that. It was like an 8-day charter. So as a 20-something-year-old 737 pilot, it was the greatest thing in the world. You're flying in and out of airports all over the country. We had another mission. We had 2 airplanes stationed at the Air Force Academy all the time. So we were basically the Air Force Academy's airline. Those missions all kind of went away in time. The Guard got 2 of our airplanes, but during the years I was there, we got to do that. I became an IP and then a flight examiner in the unit. We only had 35 pilots, so you got a lot of flying time. 19 airplanes. I think the fleet went from 0 hours to 3,000 hours in the 5 years that I was in the squadron, and I basically maintained the same amount of time as each of the airplanes in the fleet. While I was there, everybody were in the same situation you are. The airlines were starting to hire because, if you think of the history, the age 60 retirement, people got, all the World War II hires got on in the 40s, and they were turning 60 between 1979 and 1982 in that time frame. So that was my plan. I figured there might be some openings in the airlines at the time my UPT commitment was coming up. So, but then a couple of our pilots went down to this little airline in Texas that nobody had heard of, and there was a first chief pilot there by the name of Captain Ogden, and he saw those first few pilots, and they were 20-something. They knew the 737 backward and forward, and he knew he was going to grow the airline, and he wanted some experience immediately. And he said, "Are there any more where you guys came from?" And sure enough, we had a little pipeline coming from our squadron in Sacramento down to Southwest Airlines for about 10 years, until the Air Force got wind of it, and they started bringing a bunch of second assignment guys, and I called them passed over majors, but they they came in, and it kind of ruined the pipeline. But one of my buddies from the Air Force, we counted up, I think over that 10-year period, we hired about 250 guys from our squadron, which is kind of neat because you grew old with those guys, and I still keep in touch with them. We all flew together for that period of time. So I got on with Southwest. What was Southwest like in 1981? As I told you earlier, deregulation had ended. Southwest Airlines was an intrastate carrier, which meant we kind of worked around the Civil Aeronautics Board rules. They had Air California out in California, and they had Air Florida here in Florida, and we got our certificate of necessity in Texas. But then the whole idea of Southwest was these guys, I don't want to steal their thunder, but it started in the mid-'60s, but Southwest Airlines was in court all the way till '71. They didn't turn their first wheel until June of '71, and they bought 737s. They weren't going to get 737s initially. They were going to fly Lockheed Electras, just like Air Florida and Air Cal. But as you know, the 737 was an ugly little airplane, and it wasn't selling. So that's kind of a second story, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. But let me go through my background. The decision to go to Southwest, I kind of got on that little daisy train that went down here, but I did get hired by Piedmont Airlines after I'd been at Southwest for about 3 or 4 months. And it was really a tough decision. They were an ALPA carrier. They had a retirement plan. They paid union scale. But I'd already been at Southwest, and I was flying a 6 to 9 leg day. We had standardization. You had to, because you could fly with 5 different pilots in a day, and you did it exactly the same way, every flight, every day, because you couldn't do it otherwise. And it was really kind of neat. And at the same time, we were being judged by the other airlines, the legacy, as we were a bunch of cowboys. We were taxied fast. We were dangerous because you can't turn an airplane in 10 minutes, and you can't fly that fast and be safe. But we found that as we slowed down the pace, we had to change our procedures because things started getting dropped. So, as I've kind of alluded to it before, in my first year at Southwest Airlines, something happened that really burnt into my brain again, and that was the air traffic controller strike. It helped validate the fact that I'd picked the right airline. I was on the line for like 3 months, and I'd bought a little 322 out in the mid-cities between Dallas and Fort Worth. My wife was expecting. I'd gotten out of the Air Force, and now all of a sudden I turn on this thing called cable TV that was new, and I see this story saying, due to the impending controller strike, the airlines are predicting massive layoffs and furloughs. And I'm going, oh my gosh, what have I done? So I go out and fly the next day with my captain. He's a senior guy, and I said, "You think I'll get furloughed?" And he goes, "Hey, Bob, what's your seniority?" And I said, "I'm number last." I was the last pilot hired in 1981. And he says, "Well, Bob, I think if we do any furloughing, there's a good chance you're going to get furloughed." So then I've got my ear to the rail, and I'm going, "What's going on?" I find out. Now I'm kind of jumping around because we had a in-house union. We still have it. It's called SWAPA, and there's a history on that that is an amazing history. We actually went to ALPA back in the 70s, and they told us to go away. We were too small, and we formed our own in-house bargaining unit, and it's been successful ever since. And I kind of talked about it. We've never given back on a contract, I don't think, ever. So it's all been uphill. So what happened was we were having our first union meeting. We had one base, Dallas. So we rented a room kind of like this, actually like we did last night at a local hotel. And the union would put out some food, and the secretary would walk around and count heads and say, "Okay, do we have a quorum to do business?" Now, that particular year, we'd hired about 30 pilots, so the 30 of us in the back of the room behind the columns were non-voting members, so we couldn't be included in this, but we had a very vested interest in the outcome of the meeting. The way the union worked back then with one base, they did the minutes, and then they went through all the committee reports. We had a guest speaker that night, and basically he was the MEC for Texas International. He was basically giving a mea culpa, saying, "Hey, we screwed up, but I know you're in your honeymoon phase with management. If you ever need us, we're here." And then he left. And then one of our senior check airmen stood up and said, "Guys, we need to get our ducks in order because of this impending controller strike. And I have a motion." He says, "I move that we cut our trips down to 70, or basically hours, down to 70 hours a month." We were flying 100 at that time, right up to the FAA stops, before we furloughed the first man. And then there was a second on the floor, and then they voted. And I'm in the back of the room getting chills because I went home and gave my wife a hug and said, "Guess what? I got on the right airline. They're not going to furlough us." That summer wasn't easy. The controller strike really was really kind of ugly. We went out to the end of the runway, we shut down, we sat for 2 hours, and when Fort Worth approach said, "Hey, we've got a slot for you, Southwest, start them up." And then we'd start them up and we'd fly. We'd fly an hour down to Houston, and then we'd go through the same routine. And this happened all summer, but eventually it got better. We didn't lose any money on the deal, and we didn't furlough anybody. And then that policy has stood true to this day, if I remember correctly. We went through a couple of other times, even 9/11, where we never furloughed. So we flew 200s, Dash 200 version of the airplane. As I said earlier this morning, no ground speed indicator. It was VOR, DME, that was it. And the DME was a 10th, and we flew up and down, 6 to 9 legs a day. It was so much fun. Everybody liked everybody. We had this leader, as I told you, that said, "Okay, here, you're going to work hard, and I'm going to hopefully, we'll make something out of this thing." And it was kind of interesting to watch the evolution. We had the naysayers, but it worked. We kept it going. We kept the passengers happy. Our boss looked at the employees as internal customers and said that the customer is not always right. And he stood behind us. He said, "We all fly metal tubes through the sky, and the only difference between one airline and the next is the people. And if the people get off with a happy experience, then all of a sudden we will grow." And the people voted. We kind of hit on the bankruptcy, Braniff folding overnight. We had this arrival into Dallas. It was called the Glen Rose arrival. We come over from the southwest quadrant. The way Dallas is set up, they've got the arrival gates are like a bedpost, and the departure gates are between the bedposts. So we're on the southwest arrival gate, and we did this thing called a slam dunk. We come in at 210 knots at 12,000 feet, right, just 17 miles from Love Field, and we would do a slam dunk. They'd clear us, maintain at or above 5 over DFW, cleared visual, and we'd just throw the wheels out, bring the speed brake up, come on down, and we did it every day. But what really made an impact on me was to look at all those Braniff 727s and 747s, all those colors sitting on the ramp after the airline shut down in '82, and it was scary. It really was. So it adjusted the way I lived, the way I planned for my family, and as we talked about earlier in here today, you got to have a backup plan, because we're like sports athletes. You live from physical to physical in this business. So you got to have a backup. I chose not to do the Guard and Reserve because I went to the school in my last year in the Air Force called SOS out in Montgomery, Alabama, and they said that we were going to a total force concept. And that if we go to war, the Guard and Reserve are going to go with the active duty people. And I had 2 little ones at home, and I decided, you know what? Instead of doing a Guard or Reserve weekend, I'll just pick up open time. And I put that open time into my Guard Reserve military retirement plan. And after 30 years, it balanced out from retiring in the military. The jobs that I had, I upgraded to captain in about 2.5 years. We're talking about seniority. I was in Houston. Well, what happened was I was in Dallas. We opened Houston. I got bumped down to Houston. I had to commute. My wife was home with 2 babies, flying a junior captain line. I was flying 4-day trips with the commute. None of our lines were commutable in those days because they designed the line so that if you fly mornings, you had to go down the night before. If you flew PMs, you landed after the last flight to Dallas. So you had to spend the night at either end. So a 4-day trip turned into 5 days, which turned to 2 days at home. But it wasn't always that way. It built up and things started getting good. I was able to claw my way back to Dallas because we'd bought a house in Dallas and we didn't want to, commuting is not a good thing. All of a sudden, we opened Phoenix. I'm back to 5 from the bottom in Dallas again. So seniority is everything. So I told my wife, I said, oh, go out to Phoenix, go down to Houston, tell me where you want to raise the kids because it's not going to be Dallas. So we went down to Houston. I spent 21 glorious years in Houston. We bought the Leave It to Beaver house. Mama stayed home, raised the children, and I flew 3-day trips. Now we talked about bidding and seniority. I found a niche in the seniority system. Well, we got to realize bidding went from paper bid packages that you got in your mailbox to we had a guy that was very industrious. He was a computer major, and he would print it out an IBM spreadsheet that had a sort on it. And we evolved through that. That was Terry Gillespie did that. And then we moved to some early computer programs based on DOS, and then we evolved to the iPad bid sort programs. But the early bid sort programs, guys would ask for weekends or weekdays. So I found this 3-day trip that went out on Sunday afternoon out of Houston, and so it came out as a weekend trip, but it got home on Tuesday night, and it was so much fun because I lived my life. On Sunday afternoon, after dinner, after lunch, I would go in my room, pack my bag. My little girl back there would help me put my epaulets on and give me a hug, and I'd hop in my little pickup truck and drive to Hobby and go fly west we'd bounce my way, Dallas, Austin, El Paso, Phoenix, LA. I'd end up in LA for the night, and then I'd bounce around California in the West Coast sector for the second day on Monday, and then on Tuesday I'd work my way back, and I'd land between 10:30 and midnight on Tuesday night, and I'd get in my little truck, drive home, and I was done Tuesday night. That was my work week. My neighbors, who were executives with the oil industry, and they didn't understand. Hey, don't you ever work? And I would say, well, what were you doing at 2 a.m. on Sunday night? I said, I was shooting approach into LAX down to minimums. But what was nice about it was I'd get up on Wednesday morning and see the kids off to school, and then I had Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to do the stuff that you do. You know, go to the cleaners, mow the lawn, do your secondary job, whatever. And then on Saturday and Sunday, Mama was happy because we had a social life, we had friends, we did Friday night, Saturday night, church on Sunday, and then boom, off that little work again. And I always held it, even in the junior ranks, and it was a little secret. 1995, The union, I was kind of staying away from union work, but one of the guys I flew with who came over from Texas International, and he called me up. He was really heavy into the safety program in SWAPA, and he called me up and asked me if I wanted to do safety, be on a safety committee. And I'm going, how much time is it going to take? And I thought, you know what? I've always been preaching that everybody should do a turn in the union in your career, because you can't knock it unless you've done it. So I've spent a few years on the safety committee, and it was really an enlightening experience. But the cool thing about it was there was a lot of criticism of our training program. So I built a new hire training survey and sent it out to the new hires. And what is a new hire going to say about the airline that just hired them? They firewalled my survey, and then all of a sudden the head of training said, maybe we got a place for you in the training department. And then my chief pilot called me up and asked me if I wanted to be a check airman. So this blends me on to the next phase. I was a check airman for 20 years at Southwest, and that was probably the most rewarding part of my job. To be able to hand the baton to the next generation of pilots and to be able to maintain the standard. And I know a lot of your military, I was Stand Val in the Air Force, and I basically did the same thing in the T-43 world, but this is different. The airlines all have a certificate. Every airline has a certificate. That is the ATP for the airline. It's your license, and it's maintained by the Vice President of Flight Operations, and it's maintained by the Certificate Management Office, the CMO. And that CMO works with flight operations, and they write a book called OpSpec, Operation Specifications. And everything we do as an airline has to be FAA approved, because we carry passengers, and so the FAA does not have the resources. And forgive me if you already know all this, but the FAA doesn't have the resources to police an airline. So what the airline does is they select a check airman corps. And the check airman corps is tasked with the responsibility. You wear the FAA hat. You do everything. You do the recurrent simulator rides. You do line checks. You do initial training. And you do reviews of individuals that are having difficulty on the line. And the thing that amazed me the most was every time I sat down, and it wasn't just the check airman flying, but every time I flew with somebody, I would ask their background, where they came from, and it just blew me away, the experience that we had at our little airline. We had everything from, and I'm not belittling crop dusters, because we got some really cool crop dusters, from crop duster all the way to space shuttle pilots, with everything in between at Southwest Airlines. I don't know how many space shuttle pilots we got left. I think they've all retired now. Actually, I think Kegel's still there, isn't he? And a little side story, we modified the 737 elevator trim tab back in the 90s, and I was a FCF pilot in Houston because I was a check airman that lived in base. And we had 100 of these airplanes in the fleet, and we had to do all these things. So I had it down to a science. I'd go in on a Saturday, do an FCF, try to get the whole airplane checked in about a 25-minute flight. I'd climb 15,000 feet, go to manual reversion, see if the airplane pitched up or pitched down, and come back down. So they just scheduling with tag and FO. So this FO, I'm trying to tell him, okay, you fly just like it's a normal line flight, except it's different. And this and this, and then I asked him what his background was, and it was Kevin Kegel. He's a space shuttle pilot. And I'm going, oh my gosh, this guy's an aeronautical engineer, and I'm telling him how to fly an FCF flight. But that's just the awe. When I gave a check ride in a simulator situation, I would spend a few minutes getting introductions, and I wanted to know who I was checking, what their background was, and I tried to put them at ease, because I'm a big guy and I could intimidate a pilot in a check ride, but I didn't see that was a necessary thing. I wanted to see how they fly as if I'm just a jump seat rider. So I tried to put them at ease, and then we'd go in and do the thing. And I said, listen, the worst thing you can do on a check ride, and this probably goes for all of you right now, is don't dwell on the maneuver that you feel like you didn't do well. If the check airman has moved you on to the next item on the checklist, he's already said you're satisfactory and you're moving on. The people who have problems are the ones that are still back on that V1 cut that they didn't think they did right, but you live through it, and they carry that on the next maneuver, and then it kind of snowballs. But I think we have what do we have, about a less than a 2% bust rate right now. It's real small. And you know what? And when it happens, it's usually, and that was the other thing I did in the briefings too, is what's going on in your life. Did your dog just die last night? Did your wife run off with a pool boy? Or your spouse? Because we can do this tomorrow or next week or next month. So, okay. Long story short, it was very rewarding. I got to do cool things like go to Boeing and pick up airplanes. It's like buying a house. Sign for an airplane. You sign for the engine serial numbers, and you get the cross pin, and you get to fly the first flight it ever flew back to a maintenance base. I got to take airplanes to the boneyard. Last flight. That was kind of cool. I did several of those back when the 200s were going away. I think I've covered just about all that. The 737 story. I've flown the 737 since I was 23 years old. When I got out of pilot training, I went to my squadron out in Sacramento. First thing they did was send me over to United Airlines, to the Denver Training Center. We contracted with them, and here I am, 23 years old, and I'm sitting there with this United instructor getting checked out in the 737, and I was pinching myself every day. And then I got this old crusty instructor. He's probably younger than I am now, but he says, "Boy, how many hours do you have?" And I said, "Oh, let's see, I got 200 hours of Air Force time and about 200 hours of civilian time, about 400. He says, "I got that much time in the cone of confusion." So, I can probably say that I have 400 hours in the cone of confusion, or maybe more. But the 737, it's an amazing airplane. As I said earlier, it was an ugly airplane. It wasn't selling. And I was involved in two aspects of the life of the 737. As you probably know, it came off the drawing board at Boeing back in '65. It was sold to Lufthansa, the 100 model. It's really kind of ugly airplane, really was. It was short, stubby. They actually had a couple nicknames for it. And then United bought a few of them. We remembered when I was in college here in Orlando, I worked over at Hangar 1. I was during the 72 presidential campaign. United 737 flew into Orlando. We called it Herndon back then, executive. And this airplane came in. It was a United 737. I thought, man, that is an ugly airplane. And I got to vacuum it. Who was it? Mondale was on board, and Lauren Green of Bonanza was on board. I thought that was kind of interesting. He was kind of campaigning. When I went to the T-43, when I was part of my stand-board job was to go to Boeing every year for the Boeing 737 Symposium. It's a weekend party that Boeing puts on for all the users of the 737. They still do it to this day, all the VP of flight ops for every airline. Here I was, a captain in 03 in the Air Force, and I'm rubbing elbows with every VP of flight ops in the world that operates the airplane. And every airline that flew the airplane each year they took an airline that gave basically a story of their operation. And I remember this Norwegian carrier was landing in the fjords on gravel, and I thought that was kind of cool. And then we had a little banquet type thing, and the chief test pilot, there was two of us from the Air Force. He had us placed next to him, and he told me a story. He said, well, I have a soft place in my heart for the Air Force. And I said, so what's that? And he says, well, the airplane wasn't selling. And the Air Force got a contract from Boeing to build 19 737 airframes, which was the ones I flew out in California. And they built them from 71 to 73 or 74. So they drug that line out because he said they were going to close the line. Because back then, the DC-9 was king. So the other half of the story is Southwest Airlines, the reason they flew 737s was they had four whitetails at Boeing. Now Boeing doesn't do that anymore. They don't buy. They have to have the airplane designated to an airline before they build an airplane. If you go to the factory today, you'll see tails with logos on them. Everything else is still in that green aluminum. And the reason for it is they got burned with some airplanes that weren't paid for. Well, Southwest bought those 4 737s, and we operated them for 3 years, from 71 to 73, did not turn the profitability corner, and ended up selling one of the airplanes to make payroll. But when they did, they had a meeting and they said, what are we going to do? And said, well, we can fly the same schedule if we flew 10-minute turns. And that's where the 10-minute turn evolved, if you've read Nuts or any of the books. And it really worked. We started buying 737s, and now I think I Googled it this morning, and there's almost 10,000 of them built. So age 23 till now, I think I with sim time and line checks and stuff, I got well over 30,000 hours of 737 time. But then that's all I flew. That's the only type rating in my wallet. So, what else? I'm retired now. I want to thank Matt for inviting me here. I was a little aggravated that I was forced to retire at age 65, but my daughter kind of drove the point home. We were walking, I live over in Clearwater Beach. We're walking the beach a night or two after I retired, and she goes, Dad, you know what? Life is finite. You're free. You're finally free. So enjoy it. And then she graced me with a grandson. And so I am still flying. I own a little light sport airplane. I took it on a 3,000 plus mile jaunt this summer. And I did all my flying at least 1,200 feet above ground level. It was so nice to be able to see. We flew to Seattle, down to Catalina. We landed at Death Valley. We did the canyon. It was amazing. It was a couple buddies of mine, and we were in formation the whole way, and it was fun. So I'm still in flying. I'm not doing it for hire anymore. I do it on my terms. But you guys are where I was. I envy you. You've got you're beginning a career. If I had to work, as I said earlier, if I had to work in a cubicle, I don't know what I'd do myself. It's worth the risk. It's worth it to be paid to fly airplanes for a living. There's no comparison. And think of how special it is for us to be in this generation. You know, all the eons of human existence, the airplane was invented in 1903, and we got to partake in it. To be able to get in my little airplane and fly down the beach and look at the world the way the seagulls see it is just it's amazing. So thank you for the opportunity to talk. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I'm around here till the thing shuts up, so if you got any questions specific, I like to talk. So thank you very much. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much.